Monday to Friday friends. One reason to believe that the trend towards temporary relationships will continue is the impact of new technology on occupations. Even if the push towards megalopolis stopped and people froze in their geographical tracks, there would still be a sharp increase in the number and decrease in the duration of relationships as a consequence of job changes. For the introduction of advanced technology, whether we call it automation or not, is necessarily accompanied by drastic changes in the types of skills and personalities required by the economy. Specialisation increases the number of different occupations. At the same time, technological innovation reduces the life expectancy of any given occupation. The emergence and decline of occupation will be so rapid, says economist Norman Anon, an expert in manpower problems, that people will always be uncertain in them. The profession of airline flight engineer, he notes, emerged and then began to die out within a brief period of 15 years. A look at the help wanted pages of any major newspaper brings home the fact that new occupations are increasing at a mind-dazzling rate. Systems analyst, console operator, coder, tape librarian, tape handler are only a few of those connected with computer operations. Information retrieval, optical scanning, thin film technology all require new kinds of expertise, while old occupations lose importance or vanish altogether. When Fortune magazine in the mid-1960s surveyed 1,003 young executives employed by major American corporations, it found that fully 1 out of 3 held a job that simply hadn't existed until he stepped into it. Another large group held positions that had been filled by only one incumbent before them. Even when the name of the occupation stays the same, the content of the work is frequently transformed and the people filling the jobs change. Job turnover, however, is not merely a direct consequence of technological change. It also reflects the mergers and acquisitions that occur as industries everywhere frantically organise and reorganise themselves to adapt to the fast-changing environment, to keep up with myriad shifts in consumer preferences. Many other complex pressures also combine to stir the occupational mix incessantly. Thus, a recent survey by the US Department of Labour revealed that the 71 million persons in the American labour force had held their current jobs an average of 4.2 years. This compared with 4.6 years only 3 years earlier, a decline in duration of nearly 9%. Under conditions prevailing at the beginning of the 1960s, states another Labour Department report, the average 20-year-old man in the workforce could be expected to change jobs about 6 or 7 times. Thus, instead of thinking in terms of a career, the citizens of super-industrial society will think in terms of serial careers. Today, for manpower accounting purposes, men are classified according to their present jobs. A worker is a machine operator or a sales clerk or a computer programmer. This system, born in a less dynamic period, is no longer adequate, according to many manpower experts. Efforts are now being made to characterise each worker not merely in terms of the present job held, but in terms of the particular trajectory that his career has followed. Each person's trajectory or career line will differ, but certain types of trajectories will recur. When asked, "What do you do?" the super-industrial person will label themselves not in terms of their present transient job, but in terms of their trajectory type, the overall pattern of their work life. Such labels are more appropriate to the super-industrial job market than the static descriptions used at present, which take no account of what the individual has done in the past or of what he may be qualified to do in the future. The high rate of job turnover now evident in the United States is also increasingly characteristic of Western European countries. In England, turnover in manufacturing industries runs an estimated 30 to 40% per year. In France, about 20% of the total labour force is involved in job changes each year, and this figure, according to Monique Viau, is on the rise. In Sweden, according to Olof Gustafsson, director of the Swedish Manufacturing Association, we count on an average turnover of 25 to 30% per year in the labour force. Probably the labour turnover in many places now reaches 35 to 40%. Whether or not the statistically measurable rate of job turnover is rising, however, makes little difference, for the measurable changes are only part of the story. The statistics take no account of changes of job within the same company or plant, or shifts from one department to another. A.K. Rice of the Tavistock Institute in London asserts that transfers from one department to another would appear to have the effect of the beginning of a new life within the factory. The overall statistics on job turnover, by failing to take such changes into account, seriously underestimate the amount of shifting around that is actually taking place, each shift bringing with it the termination of old and the initiation of new human relationships. Any change in job entails a certain amount of stress. The individual must strip himself of old habits, old ways of coping, and learn new ways of doing things. Even when the work task itself is similar, the environment in which it takes place is different, and just as is the case with moving to a new community, the newcomer is under pressure to form new relationships at high speed. Here too, the process is accelerated by people who play the role of informal integrator. Here too, the individual seeks out human relationships by joining organisations, usually informal and clique-like, rather than part of the company's table of organisation. Here too, the knowledge that no job is truly permanent means that the relationships formed are conditional, modular, and by most definitions, temporary. Recruits and defectors. In our discussion of geographical mobility, we find that some individuals and groups are more mobile than others. With respect to occupational mobility too, we find that some individuals or groups make more job changes than others. In a very crude sense, it is fair to say that people who are geographically mobile are quite likely to be occupationally mobile as well. Thus, we once more find high turnover rates among some of the least affluent, least skilled groups in society. Exposed to the worst shocks and bufferings of an economy that demands educated, increasingly skilled workers, the poor bounce from job to job like a pinball between bumpers. They are the last hired and the first fired. Throughout the middle range of education and affluence, we find people who, while certainly more mobile than agricultural populations, are nonetheless relatively stable. And then, just as before, we find inordinately high and rising rates of turnover among those groups most characteristic of the future, the scientists and engineers, the highly educated professionals and technicians, the executives and managers. Thus, a recent study reveals that job turnover rates for scientists and engineers in the research and development industry in the United States are approximately twice as high as for the rest of American industry. The reason is easy to detect. This is precisely the spear tip of technological change, the point at which the obsolescence of knowledge is most rapid. At Westinghouse, for example, it is believed that the so-called half-life of a graduate engineer is only 10 years, meaning that fully one half of what he has learned will be outdated within a decade. High turnover also characterises the mass communication industries, especially advertising, A recent study of 450 American advertising men found that 70% had changed their jobs within the last 2 years, reflecting the rapid changes in consumer preferences, in art and copy styles, and in product lines. The same musical chairs game is played in England. There, the circulation of personnel from one agency to another has occasional cries of alarm within the industry, and many agencies refuse to list an employee as a regular until he has served for a full year. But perhaps the most dramatic change has overtaken the ranks of management, once well insulated from the jolts of fate that afflicted the less fortunate. For the first time in our history, says Dr. Harold Leavitt, Professor of Industrial Administration and Psychology, obsolescence seems to be an imminent problem for management because, for the first time, the relative advantage of experience over knowledge seems to be rapidly decreasing. Because it takes longer to train for modern management, and the training itself becomes obsolete in a decade or so, as it does with engineers, Leavitt suggests that in the future we may have to start planning careers that move downwards instead of upwards through time. Perhaps a man should reach his peak of responsibility very early in his career and then expect to be moved downwards or outwards into simpler, more relaxing kinds of jobs. Whether upwards, downwards or sideways, the future holds more, not less, turnover jobs. This realisation is already reflected in the altered attitudes of those doing the hiring. I used to be concerned whenever I saw a resume with several jobs in it, admits an official in the Celanese Corporation. I would be afraid that the guy was a job hopper or an opportunist, but I'm not concerned anymore. What I want to know is why he made each move. Even 5 or 6 jobs over 20 years could be a plus. In fact, if I had 2 equally qualified people, I'd take the person who moved a couple of times for valid reasons over the person who stayed in the same place. Why? I'd know that they're adaptable. The Director of Executive Personnel for International Telephone and Telegraph, Dr. Frank McCabe, says, "The more successful you are in attracting the comers, the higher your potential turnover rate is. The comers are movers." Don't understand that, but there we go. The rising rate of turnover in the executive job market follows peculiar patterns of its own. Thus, Fortune magazine reports, the defection of a key executive starts not only a sequence of job changes in its own right, but usually a series of collateral movements. When the boss moves, he is often flooded by requests from his immediate subordinates who want to go along. If he doesn't take them, they immediately begin to put out other feelers. No wonder a Stanford Research Institute report on the work environment of the year 1975 predicts that at upper white-collar levels, a great amount of turbulence and churning about is foreseen. The managerial work environment will be both unsettled and unsettling. Behind all this job jockeying lies not merely the engine of technological innovation, but also the new affluence which opens new opportunities and at the same time raises expectations for psychological self-fulfillment. The man who came up 30 years ago, says the Vice President of Industrial Relations for Philco, a subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company, believed in hanging on to any job until he knew where he was going. But men today seem to feel there's another job right down the line. For most, there is. Not infrequently, the new job involves not merely a new employer, a new location, and a new set of work associates, but a whole new way of life. Thus, the serial career pattern is evidenced by the growing number of people who, once assured of reasonable comfort by the affluent economy, decide to make a full 180-degree turn in their career line at a time of life when others merely look forward to retirement. We learn of a real estate lawyer who leaves his firm to study social science. An advertising agency copy supervisor, after 25 years on Madison Avenue, concludes that the phony glamour became stale and boring. I simply had to get away from it. She becomes a librarian. A sales executive in Long Island and an engineer in Illinois leave their jobs to become manual training teachers. A top interior decorator goes back to school and takes a job with the poverty program.